Tonight, we're traveling back to the shores of ancient Egypt, to a city that dreamed of gathering all the world's wisdom under one roof. This is the story of Alexandria, a city of scholars, sailors, and secrets, and its legendary library, the greatest repository of knowledge the ancient world ever knew. Before we get started, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're watching from. Your support helps keep these timeless stories alive. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's step into the marble halls of history, where the light of human knowledge once burned brighter than ever before. On the northern coast of Egypt, where the Mediterranean waves kissed the shores of Africa, a city unlike any other was born. Its name was Alexandria, a place of marble and mystery, of philosophers and sailors, of bustling marketplaces and quiet gardens. And at its heart, it held a dream bigger than any empire, a place where all the world's knowledge could be gathered under one roof. The story of the Library of Alexandria doesn't begin with a building. It begins with a vision, the vision of a man who conquered more of the known world than anyone before him, Alexander the Great. In the 4th century BC, Alexander swept across Persia, Egypt, and parts of India, forging an empire in less than a decade. But he wasn't just a warrior. He was a seeker. A man who thirsted for ideas as much as for victory. In 331 BC, during his campaign in Egypt, Alexander founded a new city, Alexandria, and ordered that it be designed as a center of commerce, culture, and learning. It was to be the link between Greece and Egypt, between East and West. But Alexander would never see his dream fulfilled. He died young, at just 32 years old, leaving his empire to fracture among his generals. It was one of those generals, Ptolemy Soter, who inherited Egypt, and with it, the unfinished city of Alexandria. Ptolemy had served at Alexander's side. He understood the magnitude of his former master's ambitions. And so, under Ptolemy's rule, Alexandria began to flourish. The docks buzzed with ships from every corner of the Mediterranean, Phoenician traders, Greek scholars, Egyptian priests. The wide boulevards were lined with grand columns. Statues of gods and kings towered over marketplaces. The great Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, rose from the nearby island, guiding sailors safely into the city's bustling harbor. And somewhere amid this growing splendor, a new idea took root. What if Alexandria could become not just a crossroads of trade, but of knowledge? Ptolemy, and later his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, decided to create a place where every book, every scroll, every piece of wisdom in the known world would be collected. They envisioned a library like nothing the world had ever seen. It wouldn't just house Egyptian wisdom or Greek philosophy. It would welcome everything: astronomy from Babylon, medical texts from India, histories from Rome, treatises on mathematics, engineering, poetry, and politics. It would be a sanctuary for human thought itself. To build it, they needed the best minds of the age. And so, Ptolemy's court sent invitations, and sometimes demands, to scholars far and wide. They lured poets, scientists, historians, and philosophers with the promise of gold, patronage, and an endless supply of scrolls to study. And so they came, by ship, by caravan, by foot, carrying scrolls, tablets, and the greatest resource of all, ideas. It wasn't long before Alexandria became a city unlike any other on earth. A place where languages blended, where scholars debated beneath marble porticos, where the pursuit of knowledge was treated as a sacred act. At the center of it all, rising near the royal palace, stood the library. The greatest repository of human understanding the ancient world would ever know. And from the moment its doors opened, it set into motion a story, one of brilliance, ambition, tragedy, and loss, that would echo through history long after the marble crumbled and the scrolls turned to dust. This is the story of the Library of Alexandria, how it rose, how it flourished, and how the dream of gathering all human knowledge in one place came, heartbreakingly, to an end. The dream of the Library of Alexandria was bigger than any one building. At its peak, Alexandria wasn't just home to a library. It was a machine for collecting knowledge, an entire city designed to pull in wisdom from every corner of the known world. Construction of the library likely began under Ptolemy I and expanded greatly under his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Though no physical remains of the original library survive today, ancient accounts describe it as a sprawling complex near the royal palace, part temple, part academy, part archive. It was said to have beautiful reading rooms, lecture halls, gardens, and towering shelves lined with papyrus scrolls. Sunlight poured through open courtyards. Statues of the Muses, the Greek goddesses of the arts and sciences, watched over scholars as they studied. Some historians even suggest the library was attached to a temple called the Mausoleum, or Temple of the Muses, a kind of early research institute where resident scholars lived, worked, and debated. But how do you fill such a place with knowledge? Ptolemy and his successors were relentless. They issued orders to acquire every book in the world, by any means necessary. Every ship that docked in Alexandria was searched. If a ship carried scrolls or books, the works were confiscated, copied by the library's scribes, and the copies were returned to the owners. The originals remained in Alexandria. The city even sent agents abroad to buy, or sometimes simply seize, collections of texts from distant lands. The goal wasn't just to gather information. It was to possess it. The scholars working in the library were the brightest minds of their time. Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy. Archimedes, who laid the groundwork for modern physics. Herophilus, who pioneered the study of anatomy through dissection. Hipparchus, the astronomer who mapped the stars. Together, they created a place where science, philosophy, literature, and mathematics weren't separated, they flowed together. A mathematician might work alongside a poet. An astronomer could collaborate with a historian. Ideas cross-pollinated like seeds on the wind. And the scale was staggering. Some ancient sources claim that the library housed as many as 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls at its height. Even if those numbers are exaggerated, the collection was vast beyond imagination, far larger than any other library in the ancient world. But it wasn't just a place for storage. It was a living, breathing institution. Scholars gathered in lecture halls to debate. They wrote commentaries on Homer's epics. They corrected ancient manuscripts, standardized grammar, and compiled encyclopedias. They even attempted to organize the knowledge systematically, an early ancestor of what we now call a catalog. Knowledge wasn't just preserved at Alexandria, it was created. And yet, for all its glory, the library was also fragile. Its treasures were written on papyrus, a material vulnerable to moisture, fire, and decay. Its existence depended on political stability, patronage, and careful stewardship. If the city fell into chaos, the library could be lost forever. But for now, under the Ptolemies, the dream thrived. Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the ancient world, a beacon that drew scholars from Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and beyond. A place where a fisherman might quote Aristotle, where a merchant's child could learn the secrets of the stars. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building. It was the heart of a civilization's greatest hope, that knowledge could be gathered, shared, and preserved forever. Little did they know how fragile forever would be. Behind the marble walls and columns of the Library of Alexandria, a silent army worked day and night. The librarians, scribes, scholars, and philosophers who cared for the world's greatest treasure trove of knowledge. They weren't just caretakers of scrolls. They were builders of ideas. The library's chief librarian was not merely an administrator. He was often one of the most learned and respected scholars of the time. Appointed directly by the Ptolemies, the chief librarian wielded considerable influence in Alexandria's royal court. One of the first and most famous of these men was Xenodotus of Ephesus. A brilliant grammarian and literary critic, Xenodotus set about organizing the massive flood of scrolls pouring into the library. Imagine a collection larger than any before, but no system, no shelves labeled neatly, no way to find a work without wading through hundreds of scrolls. Xenodotus changed that. He categorized scrolls by subject and alphabetized works by author, creating the earliest known attempt at a library catalog. It was a monumental task, and it laid the foundation for every library catalog system that would follow across history. Later, Callimachus of Cyrene, another towering figure, expanded on Xenodotus' work. He compiled a massive reference work known as the Pinax, an enormous catalog listing authors, titles, and summaries. Though the Pinax itself is lost, its influence shaped library science for millennia. Thanks to these pioneers, the library didn't just collect scrolls, it became an engine for learning. Scholars in Alexandria worked across every field imaginable. Astronomers mapped the heavens. Mathematicians refined geometry. Historians gathered and compared ancient traditions. Poets preserved and reinterpreted old epics. Physicians studied anatomy and diseases. Theories and ideas flowed between disciplines, crossing boundaries that later ages would wall off. The environment was remarkably collaborative. Imagine the great minds of the ancient world, gathered in sunlit courtyards and echoing lecture halls, arguing fiercely over the shape of the earth, the origins of the stars, or the nature of the soul. One day, a scholar might study Egyptian medicine. The next, he might edit a new edition of Homer. It wasn't about specialization. It was about integration. And the Ptolemies encouraged it. They funded research, paid stipends to scholars, provided free lodging, and supported new translations and commentaries. They understood that knowledge wasn't static, it needed to be grown. One of the library's greatest achievements was its role in translation. Perhaps the most famous translation effort undertaken was the Septuagint, the first Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Legend says that 72 Jewish scholars worked in Alexandria to render the sacred texts into Greek so that the Jewish diaspora and Greek-speaking world could access them. Whether myth or truth, it captures the spirit of Alexandria, a place where ideas flowed between languages, cultures, and continents. It wasn't just a Greek city. It wasn't just Egyptian. It was a cosmopolis of knowledge, where wisdom from Mesopotamia, Persia, India, and beyond was welcomed, studied, and woven together. But as the scrolls piled higher, and the scholars grew bolder in their inquiries, a tension began to simmer just beneath the surface. Knowledge is power. And power always draws jealousy. The library's existence depended on royal favor. It needed kings who valued knowledge more than conquest, wisdom more than war. As the generations of Ptolemies passed, that delicate balance would begin to crack. And soon, forces far beyond Alexandria's control would threaten the fragile dream of a world united by learning. For decades, Alexandria glittered, a city of light, learning, and culture. But no empire stays steady forever. The early Ptolemies had ruled Egypt wisely, balancing Greek traditions with respect for ancient Egyptian ways. They nurtured Alexandria's scholars and protected the library like a crown jewel. But as generations passed, the later Ptolemies grew weaker, more corrupt, and more entangled in foreign wars. Egypt's political stability began to crumble. Civil wars broke out within the royal family. Rival claimants fought for the throne. Factions formed in the streets. Foreign powers, especially Rome, looked hungrily at Alexandria's wealth and strategic position along the Mediterranean. And with each passing year, the library's position grew more precarious. The scholars and librarians continued their work, but they now did so in the shadow of uncertainty. Funding became inconsistent. Royal patronage, once so generous, became more political. Scholars found themselves caught between competing rulers and shifting loyalties. One major blow came during the reign of Ptolemy VIII Euergetes II, a ruler infamous for his cruelty and paranoia. Under his reign, many intellectuals were expelled from Alexandria. The intellectual community that had flourished for generations was fractured. Still, the library survived. For now. Meanwhile, across the sea, a new power was rising, Rome. By the 1st century BC, Rome had expanded its reach across the Mediterranean, absorbing Greece, Carthage, and parts of Asia Minor. Egypt, with its fertile Nile and ancient riches, was the next tempting prize. It was during this turbulent era that Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, chasing his rival, Pompey the Great, during the Roman civil wars. Caesar found a city in chaos. Alexandria was divided between Cleopatra VII, the famous queen, and her brother Ptolemy XIII, locked in a bitter struggle for the throne. Cleopatra, shrewd and charismatic, sought Caesar's support to solidify her rule. History records that Cleopatra succeeded in charming Caesar, both politically and personally. But while palace intrigues unfolded, a far greater tragedy struck the city. In the heat of the conflict, Caesar's forces became trapped in Alexandria. Under siege, they set fire to the enemy fleet in the harbor, a desperate tactic to maintain control of the docks. The fire spread. Driven by the winds, the flames leaped from ship to dock, from dock to warehouse, and from warehouse to the nearby city districts. According to ancient accounts, particularly that of the Greek historian Plutarch, the flames reached the library. The details are debated. Some say it was only a storehouse of scrolls near the docks that burned. Others claim a major portion of the library's collection was consumed by the fire. Whatever the truth, there is little doubt that tens of thousands of scrolls were lost. Knowledge painstakingly gathered over generations, works of science, literature, medicine, philosophy, all reduced to smoke and ash in a matter of hours. It was not the final destruction of the library, but it was a mortal wound. And it was a warning that even the greatest human achievements could be undone not by barbarians, but by accident, by greed, by the carelessness of war. Still, Alexandria staggered on. The city would rise again under Roman influence. Cleopatra would reign, briefly, brilliantly, and tragically. But the golden age of the library was fading. Scrolls could be recopied. Scholars could rebuild collections. But something more fragile had been lost. The spirit of Alexandria's dream, the idea that knowledge could stand apart from the chaos of the world. And as Rome tightened its grip, new storms loomed on the horizon. After the smoke cleared from Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria, the city remained, battered but alive. Cleopatra VII secured her throne with Roman backing. She ruled Egypt with skill, forging an uneasy peace between the old traditions of the Nile and the new reality of Roman dominance. But while Cleopatra was a brilliant queen, her reign was built on a fragile alliance, one that would not survive her death. In 30 BC, after Cleopatra and Mark Antony were defeated by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, Egypt became a Roman province. No longer an independent kingdom, Alexandria was now a jewel in the Roman Empire's crown. And the library? It still stood. But it was changing. The great energy that had once fueled Alexandria's pursuit of universal knowledge began to dim. The new Roman governors had little interest in supporting vast scholarly projects. They cared about taxes, grain shipments, and loyalty to Rome, not the careful preservation of ancient scrolls. The Mouseion, the temple of the Muses that had housed resident scholars, likely fell into neglect during this time. Some sources suggest it was dissolved altogether, its scholars dismissed or absorbed into other institutions. Still, Alexandria remained a center of learning, but more in reputation than reality. New libraries were established elsewhere in the city, including one inside the Serapeum, a grand temple dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. The Serapeum became the spiritual successor to the original library, housing copies of important texts and attracting philosophers and priests. But the spirit of the library, the dream of gathering all human knowledge in one place, was slowly being replaced by a new, more cautious spirit, the preservation of tradition. Under Roman rule, learning became more rigid, tied to the service of the state and the preservation of existing power structures. Free inquiry, the wild, passionate search for truth that had defined the library's early days, was no longer encouraged. And then came a new, profound shift. Christianity, once a persecuted sect within the Roman world, began to grow rapidly. Over the next few centuries, it transformed from a minority faith to the empire's dominant religion. By the early 4th century CE, under Emperor Constantine, Christianity was legalized. By the end of that century, it was favored by the imperial court. The rise of Christianity brought many positive changes: new communities, new institutions, new visions of morality and society. But it also brought tension with the classical past. Many Christian leaders viewed the old pagan texts, the works of Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, and Roman historians, with suspicion. Some saw them as relics of a corrupt, sinful world that needed to be swept away. This tension came to a head in Alexandria, a city that had always been a crossroads of cultures and ideas. As Christian influence grew, conflict broke out between pagans, Christians, and later, Muslim communities. Alexandria became a place of riots, factional violence, and religious fervor. The old harmony between science, philosophy, and spiritual inquiry began to unravel. The Serapeum, which housed what was left of the ancient library spirit, became a target. And soon, Alexandria would face a final, devastating blow, one not of fire or accident, but of deliberate destruction. The dream was flickering. The city still stood. But the library, and everything it represented, teetered on the brink of final loss. By the late 4th century CE, Alexandria was no longer the city of tranquil scholars and open debate. It was a city divided, torn by religious conflict, political rivalries, and the slow collapse of the old world. The Serapeum stood proudly on a hill, the last great temple of ancient learning, sheltering what remained of the library's scrolls and spirit. But it had become more than a house of wisdom. In the eyes of many newly powerful Christian leaders, it was a symbol of the old pagan world, a world they believed must be dismantled to make way for the kingdom of God. Tensions between pagans and Christians boiled over again and again in Alexandria's streets. Riots flared. Blood was shed. And eventually, the battle came to the Serapeum itself. In 391 CE, under the reign of Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity was declared the official religion of the Roman Empire. Pagan temples were ordered to be closed or destroyed. The Bishop of Alexandria at the time, Theophilus, led a determined campaign to erase what he saw as the last vestiges of pagan idolatry. The Serapeum became a target. According to ancient historians like Socrates Scholasticus, a group of Christian zealots, possibly under the encouragement of church authorities, stormed the Serapeum. They smashed the statues of Serapis. They burned the temples. They looted the precious relics, artworks, and most likely, whatever scrolls remained within its walls. We don't know exactly how many texts were destroyed. But we know the spirit of the library, the dream of a city that welcomed all wisdom, was dealt a crushing blow that day. The fall of the Serapeum symbolized the end of an era. It wasn't just the destruction of a building. It was the destruction of an idea, that knowledge from all corners of the world, from every culture, could exist side by side, preserved for future generations. That the pursuit of understanding was a sacred duty, not a threat to faith or authority. In the years that followed, Alexandria continued to exist. It remained a vital port city, a center of trade and politics. It even remained a place of learning in a narrower sense. Christian scholars like Clement of Alexandria and Origen continued theological study and teaching. But the Alexandria of old, the city where Eratosthenes measured the earth's circumference, where Euclid wrote his elements, where Archimedes dreamed up his inventions, that Alexandria was gone. The scrolls, written on fragile papyrus, perished in flames or decayed into dust. The names of countless authors and thinkers, the fruits of centuries of human thought, were lost forever. And yet, echoes of the library lived on. The memory of its greatness, and the tragedy of its fall, haunted later generations. Arab historians centuries later would speak in awe of the library's destruction. Renaissance thinkers would look back at Alexandria as a symbol of what humanity could achieve, and what it could lose. The dream was shattered. But it had been real once. A city by the sea, crowned by a lighthouse and a temple of wisdom, where men and women believed that all knowledge could be gathered, protected, and shared. Even in its ruin, the Library of Alexandria remained a beacon, a reminder that knowledge is precious, and that civilization is always just one careless act, one raging fire, or one wave of intolerance away from forgetting what it once knew. The story was not over yet. There would be one last voice, a final defender of Alexandria's spirit, who would rise amid the turmoil. Her name was Hypatia, and her story would end in tragedy, too. In the fading glow of Alexandria's ancient greatness, one figure emerged as a final, brilliant spark: Hypatia. Born around 355 C, Hypatia grew up in a city already fractured by religious and political turmoil. But within her father's home, she was surrounded by a different force, one that transcended conflict, the love of knowledge. Her father, Theon of Alexandria, was himself a respected mathematician and astronomer, and he raised Hypatia in the traditions of Greek learning. She studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and rhetoric. She surpassed her teachers quickly. In a world where women were often excluded from the realm of scholarship, Hypatia became something rare, a woman who not only learned but led. By the early 5th century, Hypatia was recognized as the foremost philosopher and mathematician in Alexandria. She taught openly in public spaces, wearing the scholar's robe, a symbol that transcended gender. Crowds gathered to hear her explain the mysteries of Plato, Aristotle, and the movements of the heavens. She advised political leaders. She tutored the sons of powerful families. Her reputation extended across the Mediterranean. Hypatia's school welcomed students from across religious divides, pagans, Christians, even skeptics. In an increasingly polarized city, she tried to maintain a fragile neutrality, insisting that the pursuit of truth should stand above factional violence. But neutrality was becoming impossible in Alexandria. Two powerful forces clashed for control of the city: Orestes, the Roman governor, and Cyril, the new bishop of Alexandria. Tensions between the Christian community and other groups, pagans, Jews, and even rival Christian sects, exploded into riots. In the chaos, anyone associated with the old order, with Greek philosophy, or with the ideals of reason and open inquiry became suspect. And Hypatia, for all her wisdom and dignity, became a target. Rumors spread that she used sorcery, that she manipulated Orestes, that she stood in the way of unity. None of it was true. But truth no longer mattered. In the fevered atmosphere of Alexandria, fear and fanaticism ruled. In 415 C, a mob of Christian zealots, possibly monks aligned with Cyril, seized Hypatia as she traveled through the city. The details of her death are horrific. They dragged her from her chariot into a church. There they stripped her, beat her with tiles and oyster shells, and tore her body apart. Her remains were burned. With her death, something more than a life was extinguished. It was the death of the old Alexandria, the Alexandria of inquiry, tolerance, and the dream that all knowledge could live side by side. Hypatia's murder sent shockwaves through the Mediterranean world. Even Christian writers later condemned it as a terrible crime. But the damage was done. The last great figure of Alexandria's intellectual golden age was gone. And with her, the final link to the spirit of the library. From that moment, Alexandria remained a city of merchants, warriors, and priests, but not of free scholars. The library's stones had long since fallen. Its scrolls had long since turned to ash. But in Hypatia's life, and her terrible death, the final chapter of Alexandria's dream was written. A dream not destroyed all at once, but eroded, burned, betrayed, and finally silenced. Or was it? Because though Alexandria fell, the memory of what it tried to be, a beacon for all humanity's wisdom, would never fully die. The Library of Alexandria was gone. Its scrolls, its scholars, its bustling lecture halls, all vanished into the currents of history. But its memory did not die. Instead, it took root in human imagination, growing stronger with every passing century. Writers of the ancient and medieval worlds whispered about the lost library in their texts. Historians, poets, and travelers described it with awe, a place where the knowledge of the world had once been gathered, only to be scattered like ash on the wind. The Arab conquerors of Egypt in the 7th century CE, upon finding Alexandria, heard rumors of the great library that had once stood there. Some accounts, though likely apocryphal, claim that the Caliph Umar ordered any surviving books to be burned, reasoning that if they agreed with the Quran, they were redundant, and if they disagreed, they were dangerous. Whether or not that story is true, it shows something important. The myth of the library had already begun to take on a life of its own. It became a symbol, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could be lost when empires fall and civilizations forget to protect their treasures. During the Middle Ages, European scholars dreamed of the knowledge that had been lost. They spoke longingly of the scientific wonders, philosophical treatises, and literary masterpieces that might have survived if the library had endured. Renaissance thinkers, especially, idolized Alexandria as a beacon of human potential, a golden age that must be reclaimed. The dream of universal knowledge, a dream first planted in Alexandria, never truly died. It resurfaced in Baghdad's House of Wisdom during the Islamic Golden Age, where scholars once again gathered to translate, preserve, and expand upon the world's intellectual heritage. It resurfaced in the monasteries of medieval Europe, where monks painstakingly copied surviving manuscripts by candlelight. It resurfaced in the early universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, where knowledge began to flow more freely once again. And it lives today in every library, every research center, every digital archive where humanity struggles, still, to gather and preserve what it knows. Alexandria's dream has haunted writers, artists, and thinkers ever since. It appears in poetry and paintings, in novels and films, the longing for a place where all knowledge could be protected, where wisdom would not be left at the mercy of politics, war, or greed. It became a symbol of both what we can achieve and what we are at constant risk of losing. When we hear the name, Alexandria, today, it evokes not just a city or a library, but a kind of yearning, the hope that we might someday build something like it again, a place where the best of humanity's mind and spirit can live safely beyond the reach of destruction. The loss of the library is not just a historical tragedy. It is an ongoing warning. That knowledge, once lost, is almost impossible to reclaim. That civilizations, no matter how grand, are fragile. That progress is not guaranteed. It must be guarded, nurtured, and passed carefully from generation to generation. The ruins of Alexandria's past may be silent, but the dream that rose beside the shining sea, in that city of marble and scrolls, still speaks, if we are willing to listen. When we talk about the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, it's tempting to imagine only the building, the smoke, the charred remains of scrolls turned to ash. But the true tragedy is harder to measure. It lies in the ideas that vanished, the discoveries, the wisdom, the questions that were never answered, the dreams that were never passed down. Historians can only guess at what might have been lost. Some believe that original works by philosophers like Democritus, who speculated that all matter was made of tiny, invisible atoms, perished with the scrolls. Writings on medicine, ancient Egyptian, Greek, Indian, and Persian treatments for diseases, surgical techniques, pharmacology, could have set medical science centuries ahead if preserved. Mathematical texts, perhaps lost proofs, forgotten theories, or better methods of calculation, might have rewritten the history of engineering and physics. Histories of ancient civilizations, accounts from Babylon, Carthage, Minoan Crete, and others, may have provided insights into cultures now barely understood. And literature, entire epics, plays, poems, and myths, vanished without leaving even a name behind. We know that some authors survived in fragments because later scholars referenced them. But many, perhaps most, left no trace at all. Imagine a world where the Renaissance began not in the 15th century, but in the 5th dot. Where global navigation, medicine, astronomy, and political philosophy advanced 1,000 years earlier dot. Where wars and plagues were faced with the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. The library's loss is a black hole in human history, a vast absence, a silence where voices once sang. And yet, in a strange way, the story of the Library of Alexandria still gives us hope. Because while knowledge can be lost, the desire for knowledge never really dies. The very fact that we mourn the library today, that we dream of what it might have contained, shows how deeply we value understanding, creativity, and connection. It reminds us that preserving knowledge is not just about keeping old books on dusty shelves. It's about protecting the lifeblood of human civilization, the ability to learn, to question, to grow. In the centuries that followed Alexandria's fall, humanity clawed its way back. Scrolls copied and recopied. Translations across Greek, Arabic, Latin, and beyond. Libraries built again, one fragile volume at a time. And today, in a world of satellites and servers, We are still chasing the dream firstborn beside the Mediterranean Sea, the dream of gathering all human knowledge and making it safe. We haven't reached it yet, but we are closer than ever. And somewhere, in that endless pursuit, the spirit of Alexandria endures. The Library of Alexandria may have been lost to time, but its legacy continues to shape the world in profound ways. The dream of preserving and sharing knowledge, a dream that was once nurtured in the heart of ancient Alexandria, lives on in every library, every university, and every digital archive around the globe. In the centuries following its destruction, the ancient city continued to be a symbol. Even as Alexandria faded from its once proud stature, its influence reached far and wide. One of the greatest ways Alexandria's legacy lived on was through the intellectual traditions that it helped foster. The Greek philosophers, who once taught and studied at the library, would leave a lasting imprint on the course of Western thought. Alexandria gave birth to some of the world's most groundbreaking ideas in science, mathematics, and philosophy. It was here that the heliocentric theory, the idea that the Earth revolves around the Sun, first began to take root. Though it would be centuries before Copernicus and Galileo made it widely known, the seeds were planted in Alexandria's intellectual ferment. In mathematics, Euclid's Elements, though they were not originally housed in the library, became the foundation for centuries of study. His systematic approach to geometry and logic would remain central to mathematics until the modern era. The loss of Alexandria was also felt in the field of medicine. The ancient Egyptians had developed sophisticated techniques and remedies, many of which were preserved and expanded upon by Greek and Roman scholars in Alexandria. Though much of this knowledge was lost in the library's destruction, it laid the groundwork for later medical advancements. Islamic scholars in the 8th and 9th centuries would revive much of the lost knowledge. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a new beacon of learning, where scholars translated Greek and Roman texts into Arabic. These texts would later be translated back into Latin, igniting the European Renaissance. In Europe, the Renaissance itself, a period of reawakening, was inspired by the longing to rediscover the wisdom of the ancient world. Artists, scientists, and philosophers from Leonardo da Vinci to Michelangelo and Galileo looked back to the works of Ptolemy, Euclid, and Aristotle, influenced by the intellectual tradition that had been nurtured in Alexandria. And now, in the modern age, the digital revolution represents the culmination of Alexandria's dream. The Library of Alexandria was the first attempt to gather all human knowledge under one roof, and now, in the digital age, we are doing so once again. The Internet, a modern-day library in its own right, has the potential to bring the wisdom of the ages to every corner of the earth. Wikipedia, digital archives, online universities, and open-access libraries are the modern versions of Alexandria, spreading knowledge across boundaries and breaking down barriers to education. We have learned from Alexandria's tragic fall. We've learned that knowledge, when concentrated in a single place, is vulnerable. We've learned that the pursuit of wisdom must be shared, and that protecting knowledge requires a global commitment to freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and the preservation of cultural heritage. In Alexandria's shadow, we see a world that has become smaller, yet infinitely more connected. We live in an age where, for the first time in history, access to knowledge is not reserved for the elite. It is within reach of anyone, anywhere, thanks to the digital age. And so, the spirit of the library lives on, not in the ruins of an ancient building, but in the vast and ever-growing network of human thought, understanding, and curiosity. It reminds us of the power of knowledge, of its ability to shape the world, to create connections, and to change the course of history. The Library of Alexandria may have fallen, but its story, and its legacy, are alive and well in the hearts of all those who seek to know and understand the world around them. And that was the story of the Library of Alexandria, a beacon of learning, a dream of knowledge, and a timeless reminder of how precious and fragile wisdom can be. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please remember to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of the library's story fascinated you most? Thank you for being with us tonight. Sleep well, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next story.